Welcome guys, in this video I'll analyze the fantastic game between Aryans and Alireza Firouzja from the recent Tata Steel Masters tournament. Alireza, of course, the higher rated player who did beat Aryans quite comfortably in the Norway chess. And Aryan, of course, very eager to put things right in the Tata Steel Master tournament, which he did, in my opinion. He did play a lot of good chess and made a very respectable result. And in this game, he held Alireza Firouzja to a draw, and he actually had the chances to play for more as well. But I have to say, this game is action-packed, and it went basically like a roller coaster, with Alireza having probably the lion's share of chances. So we'll take a look at this game in, I'm not going to say slow motion, but we are going to be quite thorough in our analysis here. So e4 from Aryan with the white pieces. He usually plays e4. He can play any opening move, Aryan, but e4 is his preferred starting move. And Alireza Firouzja, probably one of the few players in the world's elite that can make openings like the Caro-Kann and the Slav defense look like sharp attacking weapons, and yet again he did with the usually so reliable and solid but probably a bit dry Caro-Kann defense. So this opening attempts just to challenge white directly in the center after building up with a flank pawn. d4, d5. This is all logical, and now Aryan plays the advanced variation with e5. Of course, there are plenty of opportunities to play something else. If you like more sharp chess, then I would suggest f3. If you like controlled aggression, or probably want to play a bit more positionally, then ed5 is a good option, or even the main line knight c3. When I say the main line, this is because it's well known that this is the most played move, and probably the move that gives white the better chances for an advantage. But recently, and for a few years now, e5 has been preferred by many of the top players in the world's elite. So e5 is a very nice move, and it actually closes down a bit of the tension in the center, and now the pawn structure starts to resemble the French defense, for example. Quite closed and a bit static in nature, but with plenty of opportunities to go for a flank attack for both colors, of course. Black wants to break with c5. Sometimes white breaks with c4 as well, but usually it's on the king side that white wants to play in the Caro-Kann. Bishop f5 from black. This is the main difference from the French defense. In the French defense, there's a pawn on e6 after playing e6 in the first move, of course, so the bishop never gets out. It's basically stuck behind the pawn chain, inside the pawn chain. And in the Caro-Kann, this bishop can escape quite early with bishop f5 here. So there are some advantages to this move. Of course, more activity and a better bishop, but also this bishop can become a target for the white pieces and pawns. Knight f3 from Aryan is probably not the sharpest, but I guess the most reliable variation. There's been a lot of analysis over the years on this move, knight c3, and the plan is after e6 to play g4 and play something like this very often. Maybe even f4, but usually h4 first, and start to harass this bishop on g6. So this is exactly my point when I'm saying that this bishop can actually become a target in the opening as well. This opening has been played by many strong Norwegian players. Simon Agdestein, one of the first coaches of Magnus Carlsen, and Rune Dyrhus, one of my favorite players, and Jon Christian Hohr as well of Offerspill. So this is dangerous stuff indeed, but it's been thoroughly analyzed and proven to be okay for black. Knight f3, on the other hand, has been analyzed a lot as well, but it's not so easy because it's a move that can transpose to a lot of other variations. I mean, you can play with c4, you can play like Aryan did in this game with c3 here. A lot of different strategies connected to this move. Now, I think this is the first really interesting moment of the game. Alireza diverging slightly from the well-known and trodden path with knight d7 is probably the most played move, most normal move in this position. But now Alireza actually plays knight g6, which is quite common in the Caro-Kann. I mean, this knight needs to move in order for this bishop to develop, so it's not without its logic at all. But now Aryan, over the next moves, tries to take advantage of this knight and bishop constellation, because usually you would prefer the knight on f5 and the bishop on g6. That would be more safe, and it would give more, let's say, dynamics for black. So now knight e1 from Aryan is a very devilish move. Just planning g4 and just trapping this bishop. Of course, the black can always take on b1, but that would be just exchanging the bishop pair and a very important light squared bishop for a passive knight on b1. That would not be a good opening strategy from Alireza. And on this high level of chess, you don't want to exchange the bishop pair too easily. The two bishops, if you have the two bishops and your opponent does not, then it's quite common to say that you are, let's say, a quarter of a pawn ahead or half a pawn even ahead, if the position is reasonably open or can open. And in this position, then I would definitely think that playing something like bishop b1 immediately, panicking and playing this rook b1, and white is comfortably better, because now we can just storm ahead on the king side with a small pawn avalanche, f4 g4, and try to harass the knight on g6 and start our attack. And it's easy to imagine how strong this bishop can become without any opponent on the king side. So this is difficult long-term strategy, but if you have been on the wrong side of things in the Caro-Kann once or twice, then you quickly learn how important especially this light squared bishop can become. Because remember, if you play black in this position and you have exchanged a light squared bishop, all of these pawns are on light squares, and especially these two pawns, the root of the pawn chain close to the king, can become very weak after such a pawn avalanche. I'm just gonna experiment here, guys. f4 castles, let's say f5 again. And if you move the knight to h4, for example, and we can see how weak this pawn on e6 becomes. There's no pawn to protect it, and after a move like bishop g4 at some point, this can be really troublesome for black. So that's just to prove a point. Knight e1, and that basically forced Alireza to play h5. Just to cover this square. Of course, taking this pawn is not an option for us, because queen h4, and if you move this bishop, or for example take on g6, then it's actually mate in 10 moves on h2. That would be slightly embarrassing even for me, but even so more for Aryan Tari, a 2600 GM. So we don't do that, and this is actually a quite well-known trick. So h5 is a smart move. However, the computer does prefer knight e7, which is quite telling of black's strategy here, just to get this preferred constellation of pieces. But of course, it would be a slightly embarrassing move for Alireza to make after having just played the knight to g6 in the first place. That would be a concession, and we don't take lightly on concessions as human beings. So knight e7 was not probably Alireza's preferred choice. He played h5, and now there are some options for Aryan. In this position, it looks difficult to get this pawn avalanche going. However, white does have a lot of time here, and white can play on the queen side as well. I think my preferred move would be, after of course consulting with the computer, a4, and you can wonder about the purpose of this move. The first point behind a4 is probably to gain some more space on the queen side, to disrupt black's pawn structure a bit. I mean, if we get the pawn, let's say h4 now, and then a6. If you get the pawn to a6, this is actually typical of Magnus Carlsen as well, this strategy. Just fixing a pawn on a6, fixing this pawn structure. and getting some control over the light squares. And we know that black wants to play c5 at some point. And after having a pawn on secured a pawn on a6, then this square on b5 is actually up for grabs after a subsequent c5. So let's say knight a3, c5, knight b5. You can see how strong this knight becomes on b5, adding pressure against the weak pawn on a7 for the rest of the game, basically. So this is very strong and a very irritating long-term strategy from white. So this will be quite difficult to defend against for black long-term. So this looks very innocent at first, this a4 move, but actually, if given time, white can establish a foothold on the queen side and basically torment black for the rest of the middle game at least. So you might wonder what white's plan is if just this is met by a5. And I've played this move actually myself in a rapid game many years ago. I just played a5 on autopilot basically because I just wanted to stop white from advancing on the queen side. But now, after knight a3 again, we can see that this pawn is actually misplaced on a5. Now c5 is never really tempting for black. Let's say c5 now. Now we can see that this square can be occupied by several white pieces, and the knight can never be chased away. We do not have the pawn on a6, so there's no pawn on a7 to pressure, but this square is so valuable for white. And as we can see, that the light squares on the queen side are weak for black. So I would not recommend playing a move like a5 here, because it would substantially limit black's dynamic chances on the queen side. So this is actually a very static and not a very good move. You could play a6. This is not a bad move, but after something like a5, for example, then this pawn chain can become slightly weak. And of course, white can also just continue with knight a3 as was the original plan. c5, knight a, c2, cd4, cd4, and now we can transfer the knight to e3 and finally get our hands on this beautiful bishop on f5 and thus establish an advantage for white in the middle game. So if we can exchange this knight for the bishop on f5, then we are very happy campers with white here. And if not, then black would need to regroup and spend a lot of time getting this bishop away. And in any case, this knight is better placed on e3 than on d2, for example, or f3. So this is one of the main points behind going to a3. There's really no alternative for white if you want to develop this knight. You can go to d2, of course, but it's not easy to see or picture where this knight is going next. These two knights can easily try to occupy the same squares, so it's better to reroute the knight to a sort of square that this knight on e1 doesn't occupy or can occupy in the immediate future. So knight a3, planning to go to e3 is a very nice plan and something that you should remember with white in these positions. Aryan did not play a4 though, this computerish move, but actually quite thematical. Played bishop e3, which makes a lot of sense, just completing development. Queen b6 from Alireza. Of course, threatening this pawn on b2, also keeping the option of castling long open, as I guess is the natural alternative after having played the h pawn to h5. Then, of course, you don't want to castle short or castle kingside without really making sure that your kingside position is safe. And in this kind of scenario, it really isn't. So after having moved the h pawn so far up the board, then castling kingside is not really on the cards for Alireza, and he wants to check out the possibility of castling long. Now, what do we do about this queen takes b2 threat? Is this dangerous? Not usually, because this pawn can become weak, and we already know that this long castle is probably black's long-term strategy to get his king to safety. So opening the b file is not really something that bothers us too much, because then we can have some attacking chances. So I would actually recommend playing knight d3 here. So if black really wants to take this pawn on b2, then bishop takes d3 is the only move. Bishop takes back, and then queen takes b2. We have a couple of alternatives here, actually. Two moves that you can play. First move is bishop takes g6. This allows queen takes a1, queen c2, and alas, the queen on a1 is trapped, and king takes f1, and of course white is, it's much better here after, let's say, king f7 protecting this pawn. Black's king is a bit weak, and even though black has two rooks for a queen, this pawn structure and the weak king should make this a very nice position for white. If you don't think that was clear enough, then you can start with knight d2, protecting the rook, of course, queen c3, and then we can take on g6. This is probably more clean, I would say. Fg and queen b1, threatening two pawns. You can't save them both. Queen takes g6 with a check, or queen takes b7 and wrecking the pawn structure on the queen side. Very tempting options both, and white has a tremendous initiative and is probably winning already. So this looks very nice for white. So knight d3 could have been played just to cover the b2 pawn. c5 would have been a natural reaction from black, but we can just take this pawn, and no matter which piece you take back with, let's say bishop takes, and now we can take with the knight takes, and b4, and we are winning a piece with white because there's a pin here. So black must retreat first, and now both of these pawns are threatened, and we can, with white, choose which one to hold on to. We can play b4, or we can play f4. I would probably prefer to play f4 in this position, but that's a matter of taste, I think. Anyways, well, white should be slightly better because black's piece constellation here is not ideal, and this pawn is slightly misplaced and weak. So anyway, white should be quite happy in this position. Aryan played a different move. He played a very safe move, b3, just protecting the pawn. Probably not the sharpest alternative, but very safe. f6 from Alireza, trying to drum up some play in the center of the board. And now Aryan actually plays bishop takes h5, because as I mentioned earlier, this was not possible when black had queen to h4, but this is not possible now, of course. However, there's a pawn hanging on e5, so it wasn't a free pawn, so to speak, but an exchange of pawns. And now, instead of playing something like bishop takes g6 and de5, threatening the queen, of course, queen c7, f4, where white has a pawn to the good, a pawn extra, but is lacking the bishop pair, and especially the light square bishop on g6 can become a nuisance and actually dangerous in this position. Aryan chose something else. Aryan actually played something a bit sharper, so that's cool, and very brave against such a renowned tactician and very sharp player like Alireza Firouzja. But I would say that this position is probably more safe for Aryan in a practical game than the one he got against Alireza, because this is a pawn to the good for white, and even though black has an open h5 for his rook and a very nice bishop on g6, this is an extra pawn, and I love pawns, so I would actually go for this with white. I don't really see where the danger is coming from, at least not at the moment. Of course, that's just me speaking, but I would prefer this for white. Just develop my pieces and try to exploit the extra pawn. This might be easier to play for black in a practical game, because you can castle queenside and play down the h-file, but anyway, I don't think a 2600 GM would be complaining about this position. But Aryan assessed that his move, g4, was better, and it's a very cool move. So if black doesn't have this next move, then black is in huge trouble. But Alireza, of course, found the only move here for black. rook takes h5, a very nice exchange sacrifice. Gh5, knight f4. And of course the computer assesses this as dead equal. I don't think any of the players did during the game. After de5, knight h3, we have a mess of a position. You could wonder why Aryan doesn't just take this knight on f4, trying to get rid of the attacking pieces for black. ef4 and try to tuck the king away in the corner, for example. Maybe get his rook going. In this position, black does actually have a lot of play. This is potentially quite dangerous for white. And I think Alireza would relish playing this position with the black pieces, because after castling queenside, the black position is not really difficult to play once you see one or two ideas. For example, knight f3, e5, breaking in the center immediately, and after exchanging some pieces, bishop to c5, and you threaten on f2, and you can play d4 next move. This is super dangerous already. Let's say queen e2, then f3 is actually quite bothersome for white, because after queen f3, then bishop e4, and it's curtains already because of this nasty skewer. You could play a different move, queen d2, but now bishop h3, threatening this rook, and of course if the rook moves, then the bishop takes on f2, so this is not viable. You can play b4 of course, but this exchange operation is not to the good of the white pieces, because after queen takes f4, d4 from black, opening up the position, and as we can see the king on h1, the white king is not doing well at the moment, and these pieces are not really developed, so black is doing tremendous in this position, and would probably be a dream position for Alireza Firouzja. So Aryan made a wise decision of keeping some pieces on the board. This bishop is very important now, a very important defensive resource. de5, threatening the queen and the knight, so black must check on h3. In this position, the computer recommends tucking the king away in the corner, because bishop e4 is nothing to be worried about, because the knight goes to g4, and then the queen can go to g2, sorry, and the queen can go to g4 next. So in this position, white would be doing tremendously. King g4, king g2, sorry, is actually slightly more dangerous placement of the king, as we will see in the continuation, but this is a very high level, very, very difficult and complex stuff. And remember that the players, they've played 15 moves, but they must have spent tons of time trying to calculate and figure this out. c4, c5 from Alireza, trying to get this d4 break going in the future. f4 from Aryan, protecting this pawn of course, and just trying to keep this knight away. Queen c6, knight f3, this is of course not something Aryan wants to allow, this discovered check. Castles queenside. And in this position now, Aryan's been playing very logically, and he's been playing very sound chess for some moves now. In the entire game of course, but especially now, it's starting to become slightly more difficult to find a good plan for black. So after knight d2, Alireza strays a bit with knight b6. Still trying to get this break going with d4. Could have played something else here, Alireza. I could have played something like g6 to open up against the white king, for example. One of my ideas when spectating was g6, hg, and bishop e7. Just trying to get this rook going to g8. Could have been an option, of course. White can always tuck the king away in the corner with king h1, but there's always some tricks and some variations to calculate, and I thought it would be better to open up some lines on the king side. However, Alireza has his eye fixed on the d4 idea. Now the computer actually suggests going forward with the king, going upwards. So forwards is the only way for the white king. King g3 is a very brave move. But the king is actually quite safe on g3. There's no checks, and the knight on h4 is covering everything. Just to get out of this X-ray attack and trying to neutralize the d4 break. So you could go for queen e8, as I've marked with some of my arrows here, just trying to gobble up this pawn on h5, but just knight h4, protecting the pawn with the queen and attacking the bishop on f5. And this is actually quite good for white, because now we can see that this knight in h3 can get into some trouble. Something like this, for example. And now let's say rook takes f2, and the white should be a lot better in this position. Maybe you can take with the king as well, but this looks good for white. And the most important thing is that black is trying to attack. Black has sacrificed an exchange, but was in this scenario forced to exchange a lot of pieces, 2 sets of minor pieces, and that's never any good news for the one player who's attacking. So this would have been a good defensive strategy from Aryans, this king g3 move, trying to force black into some more exchanges. Instead, queen e1 was played by Aryans, which is a slight misstep, probably a step in the wrong direction for white, because now the queen is, I would say, slightly misplaced on e1, not protecting this pawn anymore and losing some control over the light squares in the center. So I would say this is a misplacement of the queen. That's easy for me to say though, because there are tons of variations that must be calculated in this position. But queen e1 is probably no catastrophe, but not the most impressive move either. But remember, it's all about putting your opponent under pressure, and now, of course, Alireza had to figure out the new strategy. Bishop e7, not really going for the g6 idea yet. Now rook c1. One idea that could be connected to this move is well, very devilish plan from Aryans. Of course, he wants to discourage this d4 move. But now, if let's say Alireza made some lazy move like a6, then of course knight d4 is a beautiful move that white could unleash against black. Of course, again, the point is that we want to exchange this bishop and get to this knight on h3, exchange pieces, and of course try to destabilize the black position. And this is a very fragile piece constellation, so once the bishop goes, the knight will go as well. And if you take this knight, cd, there's a pin. So the queen can't really move, can't save herself, and after a move like knight to c4, then of course we can take, but we can always just play queen e2, and if there are any worries about the X-rayed attack here, we can just bring our queen into the defense with queen f3. So this is actually quite safe for white, and once we get this queen to f3, then there's nothing to worry about. There's an exchange, that's okay. Rook takes, and as we can see, white will end up with a piece to the good here after taking on h3. Let's say b5, and white should be winning. Even though this pawn chain is impressive, it's not good enough for black. It's a piece down, and white does have a lot of pawns as well. So this is more than good enough. So this rook c1 move was probably something Aryans could have played earlier, because now the queen must go to e2 f3, which wouldn't have been necessary if it could just stay put on d1 and go to f3 in one move. But okay, this rook c1 knight d4 idea is not easy to spot, and it was well spotted here by both players, because Aryans now threatening to play knight d4 with a devastating combination. Alireza plays d4 himself. Now cd, knight d5 is is the trick, because now there are two knights trying to get to this f4 pawn, and after sacrificing the d5 pawn, Alireza opened up the d5 square for his pieces, which was a very nice positional sacrifice, but also an attacking move that probably caught Aryan a bit off guard. At least it caught me a bit off guard when observing this game. Aryan probably saw this coming. But now, in this position, we know that black is going to take on f4 next move. I mean, that's pretty obvious. With one of the knights, black is going to take on f4. And then white will probably have to move his king to g1 or h1. We know that white has to move his king. So this is a scenario where you can try to calculate all variations, of course. This will be a very difficult exercise indeed. Aryan played knight c4 in this position, which looks logical here. Just trying to exchange some pieces on d6 probably in the end. But my suggestion would be to start with king h1. Start with the necessary move first, the move you know you have to make at some point during the variation, or in this case in the next move. And then you can start picking between luxury moves, as I would call them. Knight c4 is a luxury move because in this position, let's say knight takes, bishop takes, knight takes. In this position, knight c4 would not make a lot of sense. It would not be a viable move at all. So in this position, you would probably prefer something like queen e3. The knight can go back, and then, for example, queen g1. Just trying to improve the position. So king h1 is a necessary move, a move you know you have to make. Why not start with this one? Knight c4 here, check. King goes to g1. In this position, we can see why the knight c4 move was tactically flawed as well, because now black has a move that's almost winning. At least it's super dangerous for white, and that's the tactical rook takes d4. If you take this rook, if you're greedy enough, then black can deliver mates in two ways. I would probably prefer knight h3 mate. Delivering mate with a knight is always very satisfying, so that would be my preferred choice. But of course, queen g2 is also a very nice textbook checkmate. So rook d4 can't be taken, and as we can see in this position, there are just a lot of attacking pieces from black. We can take here on d6. White is just trying to exchange some of the attacking pieces, but this is not really helping. And in this position, the key move is bishop e4. The plan is knight g5, and of course black can just continue no matter how white tries to defend. Black will have enough pieces, and in this position, rook d3, trying to exchange everything down to a winning king and pawn endgame. White can go for this desperado with d7 check, but we can just retreat with the rook. King g1 and just b5, and the king will go to a6 if we give a couple of checks, and black will be winning thanks to this advanced c pawn, this e pawn, and of course the very weak white king. Still, after b5, the white king is the more weak king, so this is probably winning for black, and makes me wonder a bit why Alireza didn't take on d4 immediately. He did see the idea though, but he started with bishop g4, and after rook c3, very nicely done by Aryan, rook d4, and we have this same kind of position, but if we take here, we can see the difference. The bishop is now slightly misplaced on g4, because in the previous variation we had this bishop on e4 after this check on h3 with a deadly pin against the king. Now there's no pin anywhere, so this bishop is not really doing his job on g4, at least not as efficient as it was from e4 in the previous variation. So still looks dangerous for white, of course, but objectively getting the bishop to e4 was slightly better. So rook d4, knight d6 check. Aryan trying to exchange off some of the attacking pieces to divert probably Alireza's attention a bit. King b8, Alireza doesn't want to exchange anything. Queen e3, very nice defensive resource, and now bishop g5 with a deadly threat of knight h3 check, winning the queen and of course the game. But this move is actually flawed, and you can of course wonder why. I mean, it's not easy to see how this move is bad by any means. And remember, guys, probably a time trouble and time scramble at this point. 27 moves played now, and they get some more time after 40 moves, as is standard in top level tournaments. As this was a very complex game, they probably spent a lot of time in the middle game. There will be some mistakes here, but that's completely natural. And in this position, getting out of this discovered check with knight h3 is it's super important for white. King h1 is actually the way to do this, and the only way to do this. So this is actually a winning move for white. So if black doesn't do anything here and plays a6, just a waiting move, just to prove a point here, then we can play queen d4, trying to of course exchange pieces and get to a winning endgame, as white is ahead materially. And in this position, white would be of course doing tremendously anyway, but we have a winning move, knight f7, just winning even more material, just to prove our point here. Knight f7, and if the bishop goes back, then we can take this bishop off, and we are left with a full rook up, and this would be enough even for me against Aryans Firouzja. So that's really telling about the situation. a6 and a waiting move is not good enough. So bishop h3, for example, threatening this rook. Again, we have this queen d4 move, and just queen e4, just exchanging queens, because if you move the queen, let's say, back to d7 or c7, then again we can have this rook c5 tactic, and if you take on c5, then there's a mate on b7. So this is why black should trade queens here. After bishop e7, let's say you play something like knight e1, threatening this nasty rook f3 while covering for this bishop g2 tactic, then black is probably lost in this endgame, and this pawn is hanging as well. So there are lots of moves and alternatives for white to convert his advantage. However, Aryan played the move that seems very good, but is tactically flawed as well. But remember, time scramble, time trouble for both players here. It's easy to miss, and I'm sitting here with the computer, so who am I to judge? Rook c5 looks like a very cool move. Queen takes, knight g5. Of course, taking on d4 is not possible, because again we have this discovered check, and taking with the queen runs into a nasty fork. So don't do this. He takes with the knight on g5, and still has a threat of playing something like rook f4 or other moves, maybe even knight e4. But in this position, black can win on the spot, and this tactic is super difficult. It's bishop e2, and then the point is rook d1, no matter what white does, basically. I mean, you can play knight e4 threatening the queen. That's not a big worry for black. Rook d1 nonetheless, and it's mate actually, thanks to this monstrous knight on f4. So this would have been a nasty surprise for Aryan, I think. So bishop e2, you can take on f4 as well. I'm just going to show this tactic because it's not so difficult to spot this, but it's a quite long variation, but it's very typical. And the two knights against the queen is not enough. Of course, the pawns will fall, and the king is too weak. So there's no hope for white here, I'm afraid. And this brilliant move, bishop e2, would have won Aryans Firouzja the game. Usually he spots these small tactics. Here he plays the wrong piece on e2. He played knight e2 check, and after king g2, the players agree to a draw. Move 30, probably not a lot of time on the clocks. A natural continuation would have been to check with queen c6, knight g4. Now the threat is of course massive, with rook f8, rook c8 winning the queen, so black must play something like bishop f5, threaten this, and to cover the f file. King g1. And now black can play bishop d3 to exchange down to a seemingly equal endgame. Looks dangerous, but if you calculate the lines precisely, then you will see that, okay, I lost my queen on c6, but I win his queen on e2, and something like rook c3 here is probably quite equal. I can just show you the variation I analyzed earlier, and this will be quite equal probably, this endgame. White can probably try for a bit here with something like b4, and if you are not super careful with black here and play something like rook a2, then white will have some chances with rook a3 and rook a7, so that's not good enough. But a move like bishop e2 to get the bishop to b5, cover the d7 square and help protecting the pawn on e6 is probably more than good enough for a draw. So let's say knight e4, trying to get this knight going to d6, and a5 probably just equalizes on the spot. But again, you could try a bit here with white, but I don't think it's very dangerous. A move like bishop c4 looks more than good enough, and here we can see that even though the bishop hangs on c4, then doesn't really make a huge amount of difference, as this will be a dead draw. So after 30 king g2, the players agree to a draw. A very up and down going game, a roller coaster for our man Aryan, but a very cool game, and a strong result for Aryan, drawing Alireza Firouzja in a tactical battle. He could have added some more pressure against Alireza at some points in the game, but we have to probably be content with a draw after Alireza missed at least one major chance to win the game. He had 2 rook d4, which was a tactical move in the 24th move, and of course bishop e2 at the end of the game. 29 bishop e2 would have won the game on the spot. So 2 tactical errors from Alireza, but a draw for Aryan nonetheless. A very good result for him in this game and in Tata Steel Masters overall.